Labas rytas,
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, participants of the conference. This is the 12th traditional international conference on changes in public governance, and today we will be discussing democratic governance in the context of geopolitical challenges. Public sector in recent years has been operating under the environment of constant change. And here, democratic governance issues arise. During this conference, we will be speaking the elements of democratic governance and the environment where scientists from Lithuania and abroad can share best practices and discuss challenges. I am Giedrius Sukinas and Giedrės Stašaitytė will be the moderators of the first part of the conference, and I would like to ask Vidmantė to explain our today's work. Thank you. Yes, geopolitical challenges are essential for democratic societies in terms of staying strong, involving and engaging citizens, and preserving public trust in state authorities. All of those who are interested in these topics are invited to an open discussion on strengthening democracy by engaging politicians and representatives and scientists. I would like to briefly present the program of the conference. First, we are going to have a plenary session, and we will be having 2 scientific keynote speeches. And also, this will be followed by the discussion by different representatives. And from 1:30, we will have 3 panels of the conference. Panel A is dedicated for Lithuanian and Ukrainian scientists who will share on democratic governance in the context of geopolitical challenges. The presentations will be made in the English and Ukrainian languages and will be translated into Lithuanian. In the Lithuanian language, we will be having 2 panels. In one of them, the presenters will discuss democratic governance, opportunities for strengthening democratic governance, and solutions. And panel C will be dedicated for practical discussions on democracy, security, and resilience, theoretical and practical insights in times of geopolitical crisis. Broadcast of the conference is available on the Seimo's YouTube channel, and you can use Slido app for posing questions. Now, a few terms on organizing and organizers. We are co-organizing this conference together with the Seimas of the Republic of Lithuania, the Ministry of the Interior, Mykolas Romeris University, and the Lithuanian Military Academy. We thank very much the Office of the Seimas for organizing this conference, helping us, and also Vilma Keidūnė, Seimas Committee on State Management and Public Authorities. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Kęstutis Bilius, Chair of the Committee on State Administration and Local Authorities of the Seimas of the Republic of Lithuania, to give his welcome remarks.
Labą dieną, gerbiami konferencijos dalyviai.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Seimas, dear guests. I'm very happy to welcome you to this 12th conference on state administration. This is an international conference where we will be able to discuss and have insights into the situations not only of Lithuania, but of other countries. We will also be able to hear about the lessons learned. Today, we're gathered here from different areas of politics and public administration, and from different countries. We have our similarities and our differences, but our task is to keep democracy alive, working, and strong. Our today's topic is very important because geopolitical changes result in the changes of our environment and the changes of the countries and affects our democracies. Due to internal and external aspects, we are forced to rethink the democratic principles and the possibility to engage people into democratic processes and how to make democracies stronger in the nearest future, and also on preserving the effectiveness of democracy. Today's conference is valuable not only in terms of our presentations, but also in terms of information exchange and also exchange of some painful experience. And the greatest added value is a discussion, a debate. When we meet people who can tell us a lot and share a lot of information, and also people who are willing to learn a lot. I believe that today's audience is able both to hear and to tell a lot. Today we're going to cover many important issues. One of them is Ukraine's experience during the war in panel A. This is a very painful experience, but the democratic world is shown that we should not forget that evil and good are always together. And the painful experience of this war has shown that cooperation of state authorities and the public in the state in the times of crisis or war is very important in preserving democracy, even in the face of the threats. So these are only several topics of today's conference, and all these topics are very important for our decision-making processes. Therefore, I invite you to be open, to be frank and sincere in sharing your thoughts, your insights on topics that are really very challenging today. Thank you very much for taking interest in the geopolitical situation in our country and beyond, and that you are participants of this conference. Thank you for caring, and I open the conference. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And now let us move to the keynote speeches of the conference. And I would like to give the floor to Professor Dr. David Schultz from Hamline University in the USA. He is also affiliated professor of General Jonas Žemaitis Military Academy of Lithuania. He will be speaking on governing without guarantees, democratic resilience in times of crisis. The floor is yours, Professor.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. I just need to switch the screen to be able to share it. And help me out here, the share screen button has disappeared from my screen. So if you could just help me out for a second. Okay, got it. Hold on a second. And can everybody see the screen, I hope?
Yes,
if so, I'll proceed. Governing without guarantees, democratic resilience in times of crisis. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation today. And I wish I could be joining you in person. I'm in the United States and it's 2 a.m. So I will do the best I can to engage you and to present in a way that hopefully you'll find my presentation to be interesting. So let me tell you first what the introduction is and what the overall summary of my presentation. The presentation examines the challenges facing global democracy, especially in Europe, as we move into the second quarter of the 21st century. It's going to look at a host of factors that have really upended the world that emerged after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. And if I can describe it in yet a different way, as by way of my summary here, I'm going to try to get us to think about really a couple of periods of time. A period of time from right after World War II up until the 90s, maybe actually I'll even say up until the 1990s, where we saw challenges facing global democracy and democracy in Europe, but that by the early 1990s, for a variety of reasons, many people thought that democracy had really emerged and had triumphed, not just in Europe, but across the world, including in places like Africa, Asia, South and Latin America. And that for several years after 1991, we thought, again, that democracy had finally emerged or won after the Cold War. But now what I'm going to talk about also are what are those challenges? What are the challenges that are making it difficult for democracy across Europe to be able to sort of be resilient? And part of my summary also is going to point out that the factors that are initially required for democracies to emerge are not necessarily the same factors that are necessary for democracies to persist or to remain resilient. So think of it this way as the initial conditions for democracy, and then what are the conditions that are required for it to remain resilient or persistent? And in the process, what are the challenges to that persistence or resilience for democracy? So as I just mentioned here, the factors initially helping to produce democracy may be different from the factors necessary to promoting resilience. And I think that's what we're going to be thinking about today, is that having established democracies, what are now some of those factors that are challenging it, making it difficult for it to persist? Some of it will be internal to countries, but some of it will be external threats in terms of those challenges here. And if I were sort of asking us a question, what is democracy? We could probably spend an entire presentation just on trying to figure that out. But briefly, I want to make a couple of different points here. When we think about democracy, I want to first invoke a U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Thurgood Marshall. And Thurgood Marshall, assessing the state of democracy in the United States in 1987, on the 200th anniversary of our Constitution, he said, think of democracy as an evolving project. You never just sort of achieve democracy in a all or nothing situation. Instead, he looked at the U.S. and said that the first three words of our Constitution were the words, we the people. And it's taken, at that point, he said, 200 years to increase and make that realization, make those first three words mean something. So we should always be thinking about democracy not as static. Democracies just don't sort of get achieved, don't just stay where they are. It's an evolving project, an evolving challenge for its political, cultural, and all institutions. Second, and again, this could take an entire presentation alone, I would argue that the whole notion of what we mean by democracy evolving over probably a 500-year period in the West is really a combination of three different sort of values. One is the concept of democracy, which is a set of political institutions that are primarily political institutions that are about giving the right of the people to be able to rule, with that thinking that the people are sovereign. Second, again, evolving out of mostly Western history, I'd say almost exclusively Western history, European history, is the concept of liberalism. That is the idea that individual or minority rights matter. And then third is the concept of constitutionalism, the idea that governments are of limited powers and that there is some overall structure that limits the power of the government. And the reason why I mention this is that when we really want to talk about democracy, I think what we want to be talking about here are liberal democratic constitutional systems, systems where majority rule balanced by respect for human rights and where the government has limited powers. And I just mention this because when we think about the challenges coming from places like Hungary and Orban, who has described themselves as what? Creating an illiberal democracy, we want to juxtapose that. What we're talking about, what we're concerned about is how do we maintain liberal democracies with limited power in which power is vested ultimately in the people. Democracy has institutional needs. If we think about it here, we could also say that for democracy, there are values. Democracy has basic values, as I pointed out, about, let us say, majority rule, about respect for human rights. And what we have to be thinking about is how for each of those values, what we need to have are particular institutions that put them into place. And so, for example, if we're thinking about a democracy that says that it ought to be ruled by the people, how do we put that into place? Through competitive elections. How do we make sure that if a democracy is all about giving people appropriate information to make decisions, it's through freedom of the press? How do we limit the power of the government? Through a judiciary. So we have both institutions and values. But at the same time, we should not ignore the fact that while democracy is a set of institutions and values, democracies initially also require a host of other factors to be able to form. Political scientists have argued that it's not just democratic institutions, but a sense of what? A civic culture, an adoption, a set of beliefs in democracy. It is also about a certain level of economic wealth and equality. It's about guarantees for political participation and for guarantees of creating a plural or diverse society for stability. Again, we could spend an incredibly long time trying to discuss all the different requisites, all the different requirements for a democracy. And there are many, but this hopefully gets us some ideas. Additionally, what some people would argue, such as political scientist Seymour Martin Lipset, is that democracy, if we look at it initially, emerged from certain levels of economic development and from certain levels of modernization. What we know from history and even for today is that democracies do not flourish unless there's a certain basic level of economic development. Incredibly poor countries, states, have difficulty creating and maintaining democracies. So some level of economic development is needed, but certainly economic development or growth, again, does not ensure democracy. Even more is required than that. There is also, many have argued that there's a historic link between capitalism and democracy, that the overlapping reinforcements between markets and political freedoms reinforce one another. And there's a certain amount of, again, social and economic equality often needed for a true democracy. Now, of course, there are some who will argue that in some cases, capitalism and democracy or markets and democracy are in conflict. But again, there is some historical evidence about relationships between the two. And again, the cultural argument, some values, some internalization by both political leaders, the elites, as well as by the public to support democracy. Values such as tolerance, political tolerance for disagreement, for rule of law. And the reason why I mention this is, again, we have to be thinking about how creating political institutions is only part of the game, is only part of how we initially create democracies and how we sustain them. We also have to be thinking about the creation and the maintenance of values, of getting the public, the political leaders to accept democracy. There's also the sense in which Robert Putnam and other political scientists have talked about the importance of civil society and the importance of of a robust civil society, independent from the government, that sustains and supports democracy. And with that, social capital, individual resources that make it possible for people to be able to act upon democratic values and to basically enjoy personal freedoms. The way I describe it to my students in the United States, what civil society is about is letting people pick their friends, letting people freely associate with one another. It's giving people the resources to be able to interact. Now, having laid that out as in terms of set of some basic values, what we could also argue, and this takes us back historically, and I'll get us up to the present very, very quickly here, is that really the rise of modern democracy, I'm going to trace it to post-World War II. Henry Luce, a famous journalist in the United States who founded Time Magazine and some others, basically in 1941, as World War II was already arising in Europe, but the U.S. hadn't entered, he calls upon America to get involved in the world, to basically use its resources and to help create what he calls the American century. And this American century is associated with, I would argue, democracy and democratic values. Because what happens after World War II, the U.S. emerges as the strongest military power in the world, initially the only nuclear power. U.S. GDP was 50% of the global GDP. It held the U.S. 80% of the world's hard currencies, a next exporter of petroleum products, and most importantly, it used those resources to be able to create what many of us would call the modern democratic world, both in international law and in terms of domestic democracies across the world. It helped create what we call the rules-based international order and system. It created the UN and other global institutions. It stood for things like free trade through GATT and World Trade Organization. And what happened as a result of that, the democratic progress since World War II. Post-1945, we know Europe was split between the democratic West, led by the US, and the authoritarian East, the USSR. The Marshall Plan and NATO were put into place to try to create democracy and security in Europe. But important, the US leadership was vital to countering communism and helping support democracy. Again, it helped build the US post-World War II rules-based order, the UN, International Court of Justice, non-governmental organizations. It stood for and supported human rights, peaceful conflict resolution, and sovereignty, respect for state borders. For many, then, this support by the US led up to the point of 1991 with the USSR collapsing, and many said it marked the triumph of democracy and democratic ideals across Europe. And I should also point out at the same time that by the time we got to the 90s, decolonization in Africa, as well as regime change in Latin America, all were pushing us towards an expansion of democracies across the world. We saw, of course, the rise of the European Union helping reinforce democratic governance, and we saw deliberative democracy spread across the continent 1991. Part of what happened in terms of also undermining this old order, as I said, this old order prior to 1991 is a variety of things. Again, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the breakup of the USSR, Nixon's visit to China, all of this becomes sort of forces that I could talk about in much more detail that help break up what I call the old order. And again, for some of you who might know famous scholarship, Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History and the Last Man, basically proclaimed by the 1990s that the old order had died and that Western democracy had triumphed. Thomas Friedman's book, The world is flat basically also described a world of global integration versus free trade. And again, I won't go through all the details here, but a famous American journalist captured a period of the time that said that these what he calls forces, flatteners, all were producing, again, a globally integrated economy, a unipolar world surrounding democratic values, free trade institutions. Again, this is the picture that we thought. And that post-1991, it looked like European democracy was consolidating. Oops, sorry. But now we have to ask the question, how resilient was that order? I'll give you a quote, because what we're interested in is the resilience here. Democratic resilience, a system's capacity to withstand major shocks, such as the onset of extreme polarization and to contribute to the performance of basic functions of democratic governance, electoral accountability, representation, effective restraints on excessive or concentrated power in collective decision-making. It's the ability of democracies to withstand, again, shocks. And we want to think about what were some of those shocks. And again, in terms of what's important for resilience, do we have institutions that respect checks and balances, federalism, in appropriate places? Does the behavior of elites accept opposition, rule of law? Are there peaceful transitions? Are there limits on populism? Because what we find is that populism across the world poses a threat to democracy and resilience. It undermines the pluralism that is necessary. Some would argue that as we think about a theory, and we're looking at this across the world right now, as we've seen in the last few years in countries from Hungary, even I hate to say this, in the United States, how do democracies break down? A three-step process. Citizens' discontent, a rise among leaders of anti-pluralists, a breakdown of accountability, all threatening it. How do we try to place brakes on this breakdown? This is of democracy. This is what resilience is about. How do we limit executive power? How do we maintain trust in government, trust among people? How do we address economic inequalities? How do we support civil society and reduce polarization? And if we think about this, and again, I don't have time today to look at this here, we could look at 6 countries, the Baltics versus the Caucasus, in terms of the very different trajectories they have taken in the last nearly 30 years in terms of how they've institutionalized democracy versus not, and how resilient they seem to be, much more so in the Baltics versus the Caucasus. Again, a table I let you folks look at a later day that ranks from Freedom House democracy scores and issues about resilience. But then the crash, the challenges, which I want to wrap up with the next 5 minutes here, the challenges to democratic resilience is September 11th, 2001, the terrorist attacks upon the United States certainly affected the United States' mental and democratic psyche in terms of viewing the world as more threatening. It is the rise of Putin and Putinism, where many of us know his quote about what the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. The new order, as I said, up until 2008, it looked like a globally integrated, US-dominated, unipolar world was the story of the 21st century. Of the first 25 years, it looked like perhaps, or the first decade of the 21st century, it looked like that the forces for democracy were still there, even though there were roots and challenges to it. But the 2008 economic crash challenged the idea of economic integration. Across the world, people became more skeptical about global connections, about integration, and with that, concerns about economic performance of countries. The 2011 Syrian refugee crisis countries started to question whether immigration was a good idea. And again, maybe we should be closing our borders, fostering a sense of nationalism. And then Donald Trump. If the US, and this is one of my themes, if the US has been the global guarantor of democracy in Europe and of democracy around the world by pushing it and supporting its values and institutions, Trump's first term challenged that. His version of the world or vision of the world was against multilateralism. His questioning of NATO, his engagement in trade wars, his shift away from Europe and European security towards focusing on China, and his disregard for global alliances all raised the question about whether the US was going to be still a strong supporter of democracy. Of course, Brexit also challenged that. And in many ways, people don't think about it, but Joe Biden's America was in many ways a continuation of a lot of what Donald Trump did, perhaps with a softer touch, but he still remained focused on China with an economic nationalism. At the same time, his abrupt pullout and abandonment of Afghanistan led many people to wonder, is the United States still a reliable ally? And the way Biden hesitated in his support for Ukraine, oftentimes in 2023, 2024, all raised these questions. The rise of BRICS, that is of many other countries that included Brazil, Russia, India, China, South America, or rather I should say South Africa, all again challenged the US globally dominated world. Freedom House has charted the decline or retreat from democracy across the world over the last couple of decades. The pandemic, yet again, challenged democracy and the openness and reinforced again nationalism. And of course, climate change and global warming, which we don't usually think about, is challenging how we may be thinking about the world and democracy at a time when we need more cooperation. Countries are pulling away from it. And of course, unfortunately, both 2014 and 2022, the attack and invasion against Ukraine. And now the Israeli-Gaza war, the acceptance of aggression as a tool of foreign policy. And we have yet to figure out how artificial intelligence and the rise of the cyber world challenges our old notions of the nation state, of borders, and of security. 2021, the storming of the US Capitol shows a breakdown in the United States, again, of support for democratic norms, and the return of Donald Trump, now in his second term, all gets us to the US commitment is in question. His new presidency, again, raises doubts about the US support for European democracy, and the erosion of US leadership and support for international law weakens transatlantic alliances. We now are seeing the death of that new order in 1991, the end of the American century, perhaps, and the collapse of the rules-based physical and geographic-based concept of sovereignty. So now, as I close, what will the next 25 years of the 21st century look like? Are we returning back to pre-1945? Is Europe going to be on its own? What happens with a divided Ukraine? What happens with a standoff or a conquered Taiwan if it were to occur in a world that's more divided and fragmented and a multipolar world of power politics? In conclusion, so far, post-World War II, US and European institutions have sustained democracy, but the geopolitical shifts in the United States and across the world are threatening this resilience. And thus, for this conference, thinking about the challenges to democracy, as I titled it, Government or Democracy Without Guarantees, what do we do in a world where the United States may not be a reliable democratic guarantor, or democracy does not look like it is secure as it used to be? Thank you very much.
Dėkojam profesoriau.
Thank you, Professor Schulz. Are there any questions? Anyone wishing to ask questions? I see no questions. I believe that we will be able to do that on the Slido program app. Professor, we have a question for you. You visit Lithuania often, every year or even more often. You spoke about the threats today and about the actions, but looking at Lithuania, as we wish to strengthen democratic resilience, what would be your recommendations for Lithuania? What Lithuania should undertake in its efforts to strengthen the democratic resilience? What would be your recommendations, Professor?
Just different recommendations, some of which may, well, I'll give you recommendations that I think that are within your control, because clearly there are some challenges that are beyond, let us say, Lithuania's control. But first, it is internally. I think internally there has to be a maintenance of support for people to continue to believe in democracy. Part of what's happened across the world is that when countries no longer look like they can perform well, to use an American phrase, when democracies cannot deliver the goods, cannot satisfy the needs of their people, or the government institutions are not working properly, again, to deliver economic or social goods, that's when support for democracies are undermined. And so first, it is to what extent can Lithuania continue to, as a government, perform well in terms of its efficiency, in terms of making people feel confident that the government is making a difference in their life. And maybe that's the best way of describing it here, is that there has to be a belief that government matters and that democratic governments matter. And so to what extent can you, as Lithuania, make people feel like that democracy still works in terms of it's to their benefit, and so they don't say something to the effect of, well, maybe a non-democratic government would work. If I can tell a quick story, a very quick story here on this, then I want to get one other factor here. About, I think it was about almost 15 years ago, I was teaching in Yerevan, Armenia. And I was down at their Independence Square in Yerevan, Armenia, and there was a woman who was begging for money, and I stopped to talk to her with what little Armenian that I know, which is not very much, and what she said to me was that we had a revolution in 1991, and the Soviet Union collapsed, and she said, I had so much hope for democracy. But then she said to me, I'm now begging in the street. And she looked back to the Soviet era and she said, you know, and maybe she was distorted in her views, but she said, things looked great back then. I didn't have to beg in the street. And the only reason I am mentioning it, whether or not her observations are accurate, she didn't support what she thought was democracy in Armenia because she was begging in the street, had lost her pension or most of it. And so to me, when I say democracies have to deliver, they have to make a difference in people's lives. Second, I think Lithuania is doing this, and the second one is that as the US is becoming a less reliable guarantor of supporting democracy in Europe, Lithuania, along with the rest of Europe, has to build stronger alliances. It has to build stronger connections because in many cases, maybe the American century is over. America is no longer there to guarantee democracy or security. And that would be the second thing, is strengthening and building those alliances. So one, it's the internal aspect of showing how democracy makes a difference to people. And two, building those external alliances to basically ward off the external threats.
Mielas Deividai, ačiū Jums.
Thank you, Professor Schulz. We could keep on discussing, but it's time for another presentation, a keynote speech. And now I'd like to give the floor to Associate Professor Dr. Austra Šukvietienė from Mykolas Romeris University, and she will be speaking on tools for democracy, the tools we have, and how do they work in practice. The floor is yours. Good morning.
Taip, bet neteisingai atsidariusios. Sekundėlę. Gerai, pabandysim tuomet paprastesnį variantą. Taip, tai atsiprašau labai už techninės.
I'm very sorry for some technical inconveniences. I hope that I will be able to share my slides. I'm Rasa Šukvietienė. Professor Schulz have made a very important introduction, and therefore I will save some time because of that. We do not too widely discuss why democratic governance is important, what democracy is, and how different scholars define democracy. Professor has spoken a lot on that. I want to stress that democratic governance is based on institutional system, which helps to ensure this democratic governance. Therefore, democratic governance must therefore create open, responsive, and accountable institutions and processes that meet the needs and preferences of society, ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to participate and express their views on how they will be governed. Different authors discuss different characteristics describing democratic governance. All of them highlight political aspects and transparency, while others are more focused on the maturity and or social capital aspects of civil society. So I think many are familiar with the 12 principles of good governance, which are currently being discussed so much by international organizations, but they can perhaps be summarized by 4 key points, including participation, accountability, conflict resolution, equality, and justice. So if citizens are, or at least should be, at the center of this topic, I'm sorry, my slides are not switching.
Taip, ačiū. Tad jeigu
If the citizens are at the center of this topic, the first thing to do is to highlight the ways in which they can participate in governance. They are usually divided into civic and political participation, but a more detailed breakdown on these forms in the figure on the left. shows that even if the most passive ones contribute in some ways to governance. For example, by not participating in elections, not agreeing or agreeing to pay taxes, and so on. So when it comes to democratic governance, it is not only those who are actively involved in decision-making, but also those expressing their opinions that matter. Civic Power Index is a good illustration of public sentiment in Lithuania. The civic power of the Lithuanian public has not changed significantly, with an average score of 36.8 out of 100 in 2024, compared to 36.7 in 2023. However, the most popular activities in Lithuania, according to the PGI, are donations to charity, participating in environmental cleanups, participating in local community activities, and so forth. Although political consumption activities and charitable donations have slightly decreased and participation in protest politics has decreased due to the election period, we can see the fluctuations and a slightly small growth of civic power. Due to different ways of involvement or participation and the environment in which they operate, it is very important to choose a proper way of engagement and to discuss the challenges that arise in such situations. Also, the different modalities of participation and the factors that make them work in practice often pose challenges for both the institutions implementing them and those wishing to participate. One of the aspects I want to mention is that democratic governance is not only about public participation for the sake of participation, but engagement and participation has to have a clear goal, and defining those goals would allow for both sides to choose the most appropriate ways of participation, the role of citizens in the governance process, and to avoid unnecessary conflicts or other disturbances in the process. Of course, it also should be mentioned in this context that even participation for participation's sake can contribute to the formation of social capital, which has been seen by some authors as the non-cost alternative to social welfare provision. The very idea of democratization or democratic participation in governance should therefore be understood as ensuring democracy, reflecting the interests of society, and making decisions that reflect its interests. And depending on the political cycle of involvement, political instruments should be chosen accordingly. On this slide, you can see possible ways of participation or engagement and the instruments that can be employed for that. I will not go into detail here, but I would like to briefly give my remarks. On this slide, you can see the ways of engagement, and they can be divided into groups. Such ways of participation, such as information, public meetings, and public consultation, are employed by different public authorities and institutions. These can be called traditional instruments of public engagement. The remaining instruments, such as open innovation practices, citizen research, and the rest, do not have deep application practices or best practices that we can discuss. In this context, I would like to speak about participatory budget and participation in considerations. Participatory budget is a rather new thing in Lithuania, but this tool has made a real breakthrough irrespective of the area, whether in schools or in municipalities when citizens' projects are being implemented. But in terms of participation in considerations, we do not have best examples here. But in the near future, I believe we will be able to speak about this and say that these instruments are consistently used and employed in Lithuania, and be able to discuss the positive impact of the employment of those tools. Using the tools themselves does not strengthen democracy and do not create a society that could be able to participate. Responsible institutions should also see the meaning in that, and this should not only go down to some formal inclusion. When we speak about civic sentiments and their attitudes towards the state and conditions for failed democracies, it is important to discuss the environment where all the democratic tools operate. Starting with trust, on this slide you can see the changes of trust within the European Union and in national institutions and in the European institutions. As you can see, in exceptional periods, public trust reaches 40%, while in other periods only 1 in 3 people have full trust in their public institutions. The situation in Lithuania is also very similar, with the latest Vilmorus poll showing that 17.4% of the population trust the Seimas, 25.8% trust the government, and 40% trust municipalities. And the greatest distrust can be seen in terms of political parties, and the greatest trust can be seen with various institutions responsible for security and defense. Only 1 in 3 citizens in Lithuania trust municipalities, but around 50% of citizens trust public authorities. But the main aspect is that I want to mention is that trust in the recent 10 years has been changing and fluctuating, showing the sensitivity of this issue and the sensitive attitude of the public towards the geopolitical developments. When we are trying to answer or speak about the reasons for distrust or trust, I have found a quotation that artificially strengthened institutions result in distrust or excessive trust. It is natural that the operation of institutions and the ability of the institutions to ensure the basic needs for the population and the rhetoric of the institution has the influence on people's trust in public authorities. The quality of government index in the figure shows perceptions and personal experiences of regional quality of government and allows for a comparison of the mood in different regions over time. As can be seen, the situation in terms of the quality of government has improved somewhat in many countries. Dark blue shows the greatest trust, and the situation seems to have improved across Europe and in Lithuania. And in 10 years, we have moved from minus 0.718 to the positive score of 0.1. But there are still some challenges here. I do not know whether you can see here on the slide, but Lithuania can be divided in 2 regions. According to the 2024 index, Western and Central Lithuania had the index of minus 0.104, whereas the index for Vilnius region, this another region, is plus 0.191. So you can see the difference here. Another aspect that I want to discuss is the engagement of stakeholders and engagement of citizens. On this slide, you can see the participation of citizens and stakeholders in legislative processes. Statistical tendencies are very similar. So the bar shows 2024. White dot goes for the data in 2015. As we can see, we are ahead of the OECD average. And our statistics is not that bad. So far, we don't see any greater changes or breakthroughs in this area. In other countries, we have a completely opposite processes where the engagement of citizens is much lower compared to the previous years, and we see that democratic participation actually is falling in those countries. Speaking about the reasons for that and possible solutions, is that we need to increase public participation. As we can see in this slide, 1 in 3 citizens do not believe that they can make change, and they need some additional encouragement for involvement. When we're looking for solutions, we consider different tools such as electronic voting. And these tools were actually employed, especially during the pandemic period. When we speak about this topic, we see very many threats, as the professor has mentioned. Therefore, we have to do our homework. Artificial intelligence is often mentioned as a threat in public administration. But artificial intelligence is not a new tool, and in many countries, including Lithuania, artificial intelligence has long been employed. Of course, we are facing cybersecurity challenges here, and also presentation of clear and accurate information in this electronic noise. But it also is related to our preparation as citizens, or our readiness as citizens to employ these changes. I would like to briefly mention or present the study that was carried out in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland on administration processes. Certainly, this is not the area for us to compare with Lithuania. But the public sentiment is very important here, and in terms of Lithuania, we should also consider that very much. 1 in 2 citizens have been found to feel stressed when communicating with public authorities. And therefore, 9 out of 10 citizens would opt for electronic governance services. And many citizens support the use of artificial intelligence in public governance. but on the condition that the final decision on, say, personal situation of a person is taken by a human being rather than artificial intelligence. The main reasons why people opt for live service rather than e-service, 1 in 2 say that this is a habit, and others say that they do not trust this system or their skills to function in the electronic governance or e-governance system. So we have to bear in mind not only the necessity to move digitally in our governance, but also in educating our citizens' trust and skills in this area. When we speak about civic power index, it shows that it differs among different age groups. Many studies show differently that public power index depends on educational background rather than age. This slide shows the turnout of the Lithuanian citizens during the parliamentary elections last time. And we discussed a lot that young people were very passive. 52%, we had a 52% of turnout during the first round of parliamentary elections, but the turnout among the young people was only 35%. Here I would like to stress that other studies show that young people think that their voice doesn't matter, and they do not trust the knowledge that they have, or they lack knowledge or the information on the elections that are being presented to them. Or, for example, the information that is being provided on the elections or on political parties and their political platforms is beyond the access to young people. Social media is the main source of information for young people. In Lithuania, Facebook is the main social media. In other countries, this is Instagram. And we have to think of how much quality political content we have on social media, such as Instagram or Facebook. And here we have to learn from the experience of other countries. The results there show that politicians who were very active on TikTok actually received very wide support from younger people, and even more radical forces that are very active in using social networks can affect young people. There are many practices that are employed by different countries. Some countries have interactive web pages for young children in the age group of 6 to 7, where children are given information on political participation, on the election process. Or, for example, in Sweden, during the electoral period, students, school pupils meet with politicians. Simulations are being organized. In Lithuania, we had similar initiatives launched last year, but this was probably not fully comprehensible to the public. In conclusion, We do not have a one set recipe, but there are several aspects I would like to stress. First, informational noise. Institutions are working very hard in order to clearly communicate their information, to present all the data, but we as citizens do not access all the web pages of public authorities or read all the information. Therefore, the main task is to ensure that this information is accessed by young people. Another aspect is a regional one. Participatory instruments have to be independent of the regional dependence. We should also be considering the differences, age gaps or generational differences, and we should be thinking about the inclusion of people of different ages. And e-governance should also be employed further on. We will have many more tools in the future. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention, and I'm ready for your questions.
Ačiū, Aušra.
Thank you, Aušra, for your presentation. Colleagues, are there any questions? We have time for one simple question. Professor Yaroslav Tvorok from Klaipėda University, thank you for your presentation. I would like to make a few remarks on the youth and information sources. I would like to argue with your data because we have data from our city, from Klaipėda, and we can't say they apply to the whole Lithuania, but young people in Klaipėda said that the main information source, of course, social media, but there's also another source when it comes to politics is the family, and many ideas come from families, and parents have a major role in the political literacy of young people. And when you talk about regions, we are from the West, which is characterized by a lesser trust in the government, and we need to work with the regions. Today, I'm going to talk about equal opportunities, and you mentioned the importance of e-governments. People who are slightly older, not necessarily old, e-governance is not accessible, and it is stressed by our institutions that the traditional methods of interaction are also necessary. We need the e-governments, but everyone needs to be ensured the access to them. And during our research, we talked to slightly older people and organizations, and older people don't always use bank cards, let alone e-services. When it comes to public transportation, people now are allowed to pay for their tickets with their cars, but older people are very reluctant to do that. Thank you. Thank you for your comments. As I said, not a single age group should be excluded, and I'm not saying that the traditional interaction measures should be abolished. I'm not saying that. As for the youth, there are several interesting details. I presented the Eurostat data, but there are other surveys in different countries, and the trends seem to be similar. The role of the family is important. Several years ago, there was research encompassing all Baltic countries, and the Lithuanian part included only one region of Lithuania. But depending on the question, people have different young people have different people to ask about different questions. And we had surveys in Lithuania showing that parents spend only 7 minutes with their children every day. So how can they influence their children? So I think it depends on a concrete situation. But in this case, I would agree with your comments, but there are certain nuances which should be taken into consideration. As Plato said, the truth is born in the discussion. So thank you, Aushra, for your presentation, and thank you for your comment. Another question. Have we got time? One more question. Okay, the floor is yours. Tomas Guruolis from the Confederation of Lithuanian Industrialists. We can talk about the potential of the society and business and then create certain mechanisms to realize that potential. And that potential is very important today when we talk about defense, about defense industry, because we need to focus on technology. And there's a tendency that civilian technologies merging with military ones, and those mechanisms mentioned today, in order for them to work and for the ecosystems to appear, we need to reach a common goal. And we need to realize the creative potential of our people, and we have made proposals for the Seimas Committee for the Future several years ago. So thank you once again for your presentation. Thank you for your meaningful insights. Overall, I could say that democracy is not a given. It needs to be created and defended, and the mechanisms of democratic governments help to foster democratic. We need to create tools that foster that resilience, but even things like education and fostering education has a role in democracy. As our discussion has started, I would like to invite everyone to join our panel discussion. The panelists of the discussion is Professor Dr. Valdas Rakutis, member of the Committee on State Administration and Local Authorities of the Seimas of the Republic of Lithuania, Ms. Alicija Šarbaitė, Vice Minister of the Interior of the Republic of Lithuania, Professor Dr. Giedrius Česnakas, advisor to the Minister of National Defense, Mr. Darius Varnas, Mayor of Ukmergė District Municipality, and Professor Dr. Vainius Smolskys, Head of Public Administration Studies of Mykolas Romeris University. Colleagues, we're about to have a panel discussion, and all of the panelists will be able to make their intervention on one issue, and then there will be some time for remarks, and there will be 3 rounds of that. After the 3rd round, we will invite other participants to join the discussion. Let's begin with the first question. And according to the list. I'll ask Professor Valdas Rakutis to begin, then Ms. Alicia and other panelists. And my first question is that we talk about democracy, about strengthening of the democratic governance, and looking from the perspective of the institutions you represent. Could you please name the main recent challenges to ensure democracy? Is the geopolitical situation a factor? What are the trends that you see in this field? Professor, the floor is yours. The main challenge that arises is that despite all the efforts of the democratic world, the war is still taking place and we see no end to it. And when we talk about democracy being superior, we also see that democracy can solve issues and the society needs to take action to solve that. And we are doing a lot through these efforts, through various organizations supporting military industry, which was neglected the support for many years. So this is the trends that we see. While in other regions, for example, Balkans or Caucasus, we see the disappointment in democracy. But the problem is that we are afraid to say to ask the question, why can't we solve this question? And then we find ourselves in a vicious cycle when we talk about strengthening of democracy, but actually the real power is what matters. Why does North Korea gets involved into the war, but the European countries are afraid to send their troops because they will be crossing certain lines. And those observers who are still on the fence, they have more trust in the East. And the map that the professor showed at the beginning is showing those zones of change. And we can talk about aggressor, but we can talk about the crisis of democracy as a phenomenon. But it is a very unpopular topic. It's not a nice topic. But we avoid uncomfortable questions, but the issues are increasing. We tend to distort the reality and we refuse to solve the problems in the way they should be solved. Talking about our Seimas and our parliamentary committee, we are a peaceful committee, but there's one question aside. What is the link between municipalities and the state governance? Are municipalities under the government? And municipalities are involved into the governments to the extent they wish. But if this continues to happen, we are going to have the problems we had in the 17th century, where the the little parliaments of the country had no rights to vote. We have some strange experience when the democratic Commonwealth was destroyed by 3 empires, and we had the same disadvantages, which is namely liberum veto. For example, now Slovakia or Hungary is preventing certain decisions, and this is a disease of democracy which can lead to the same consequences, especially if hostile countries, dictatorships, if they know how to use this method and interfere with our elections and other processes without the other side being able to respond. So we need to talk about these problems, and we need to look at the weak spots of democracy and to address those issues.
Thank you, Professor. Alicija Ščerbaitė. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. While speaking about the tendencies in today's geopolitical context, we've been seeing that the public has become more demanding, inclusive. Well, the first tendency that we have seen in the study presented before is that there is a fatigue, institutional fatigue, participation fatigue, communication problem, because public should trust public authorities and be communicated in a timely fashion. Another aspect is the lack of access. There are different tools that encourage participation, but they are not accessible and available to everyone, and this actually hinders democratic participation and defense of democracy. Now, speaking on other trends that I can see is that public services provided by public institutions should be available and accessible to everyone and trusted by the public. The public has to be convinced that the state is not against its citizens and that the public authorities act in accordance with the legislation and documents adopted. Another aspect is technological changes, all the technological changes and innovations that we see, because investments have been made into innovations, but population requires dialogue. Youth was mentioned before. Yes, young people use social platforms and social networks where information can be presented, but young people have to be invited into a dialogue. The same should be made with the older generation, and we should also focus on older generation. So all these aspects are interdependent. Thanks. And I believe that proper communication is a solution. Public authorities inform the public on the changes, introduction on new processes or procedures, but we do not tend to inform the public on why the changes were introduced, and therefore the distrust is born and people are looking for alternative ways, or for alternative information that would be clear to them. And therefore, I agree with Professor that it hinders the defense of our democracy, especially in today's situation that the world is in. Now, let us move to Giedrius Česnakas. Thank you for your invitation. I will just mention the main challenges from the perspective of the defense of Lithuania. The main challenge for democracy is very simple, is survival of the state. We've seen this situation in Ukraine, and we saw the ultimatum sent by the Russian Federation to NATO and also to the government of Ukraine. And this was a direct interest and an attempt to extend its influence with a smaller influence from the West. We see the example of Russia. Democratic processes and democracy is the first target for Russian agents because they aim at destroying democracy. Take oligarchs or some political groups that are actually limiting democratic processes and limiting democratic participation, which then results in indirect takeover of the statehood. And in terms of Ukraine, we can see that Russia is ready to take direct military actions against a country that is not willing to obey. And Russia is extending its military power, its military forces and military industry, and working hard against the Western societies. We also have to acknowledge that we are in the state of constant information war. And today on the social media, I saw a former candidate who is praising a country beyond our borders and is actually challenging the security of our state and its institutions. But this is just one of the examples, but attempts or targeting democracy is multifaceted. It takes information, space, and employs other levels. Sometimes we feel the lack of checking information on media outlets or, for example, handbooks for schools. And the third aspect that we can really see is technological challenge for democracy and democratic governance. We have to admit that we live in the new era, which is an era of algorithms, because all our social news, social media, and search are governed by algorithms, the way they're programmed or purchased by different corporations, because corporations can form algorithms and actually buy this by our possibility of access to information. So this challenges the reality, the difference between the reality and lies. And we see the creation of bubbles where there's no communication between those bubbles. Or we see the artificial confrontation created between the public authorities and the wider public. And there's also a possibility for fake news and possible generation of the news and images on the internet. This is something we should prevent and work on very hard, because this shows that the tools are available for helping to erode democracy and to destroy democracy. And these are the tools that we have to primarily target. Thank you very much. And now let us move to the mayor. What are your insights on that? I will be speaking on behalf of municipalities. My colleagues were speaking on the global level, and I will be more down to earth. The tendencies that we see, and Ukmergė district is not a small municipality, but my observations are the following: that there is a lower trust in public authorities, but this does not mean that the public authorities are evil or doing something wrong, but there is an understanding that public authorities lack skilled people, and different public processes take too much time. And many people choose private sector as a more profitable one. The age group in our municipality is getting younger. Another aspect is geopolitical tensions. Previously, people were used to participation, to active participation. We had that in our municipality. And the trust in municipalities was 40%, which was stable, as Professor Šukvietienė said. Digitalization is another challenge. Yes, some people cannot access digital tools, but finally we need to realize that digital world will be surrounding us. But this leads to another problem of cybersecurity. So it means that we really have challenges. But I'm asking you, I'm inviting you to stop fear-mongering, scaring people, speaking about the war on social media, on social networks. I meet people in municipalities, we speak to them, and one question that I'm asked at all times is, when will this fear-mongering stop? So this is my request for all of you.
We started from global topics and now we've moved to ordinary people, and I think your people are very lucky because they have a great mayor. Let's move on to the academia, Professor Dr. Vainius Smolskys. Good morning. I would agree with Professor Rakutis and Professor Česnakas. I would agree with these ideas that geopolitical challenges are important, and someone mentioned the Caucasus and Balkans, and one of the most important challenges is managing the corruption. And I'm talking about systemic corruption, and the whole Balkan region is characterized by systemic corruption, and it leads to distrust in the government. I hope, well, in Lithuania we do have individual corruption, so we can be proud of that. And when people lose their trust in the government, the participation becomes a fiction, and the government positions are taken by the people who are promising quick solutions. Colleagues, have you got any comments regarding that? We have 2 more rounds of questions, but we will merge those questions in order to save time, so we can have more time with the audience. So the following questions are, what are the good experiences of the public sector to add to the strengthening of democratic governance? And what are the recommendations for the public sectors for the future from your position, from the point of view of your institution? And I would like to start with Professor Rakutis. Best practices, in my opinion, are the practices by social organizations and other organizations, and they're characterized by volunteers and independent solving of problems. And those organizations are the foundation of democracy. And then people are oriented into activities which often lead to results. And the quality of those organizations is very important. And when those organizations manage to include into the training young people and children, as it is the case in the Rifleman Union and Scouts, and then people will tend to get involved into those institutions. But we have the data that less than 1% of young people in Lithuania are involved in the activities of organization. I think at least 10% of young people should get involved into those organizations. And those organizations are sometimes seen as existing for their own sake. But this is a mistake. And as for the perspectives, I am glad that we are being praised, so people's trust increases and the people are satisfied. But there are questions, issues that are fundamentally dividing our society, and there are some heated discussions that can lead to no consensus. and it results in polarizations, which is the goal of our enemy, divide and conquer. So we need to provide the context to avoid polarization. We also need to pay attention to the emerging revolutions. What is a revolution? It's nothing good. It's a shock to the society leading to a collapse. And it has to do with social gap, social exclusion, people who live in social bubbles, and it will erode our democracy using the means of the same democracy. It is important to say that we need to understand what undermines democracy. Can democracy manage to defend itself and develop? Look at the Balkans. It is our problem to ensure the development of democracy there. So, if democracy suffers in Macedonia, Serbia, we will all suffer. We have demographic problems, but we're not doing anything. But this is a key problem. It is a fundamental problem for Lithuania. And do we defend our values? The US is saying maybe Putin is fine. Our system is... They say that Putin is a nice guy, which means that our systems are collapsing.
Now the Minister of the Interior, Alicija Šarbaitė. Participatory budget is one of the tool and initiative that should be developed, and people should be taught on how they could involve in budgeting. Social initiatives is another tool. People should be closer to public institutions, and in terms of recommendations, I will speak for clearer communication and a clarity of communication. People need to understand why changes are needed, and faster involvement and engagement of citizens into the decision making, and a closer dialogue between the state and the public. We see this as the problem, and we are trying to deal with these issues, address them, and to speak with society, to invite the society to join us in taking the decisions and taking the responsibility and taking part in the governance of the state, because the geopolitical situation is very difficult. We have to defend democracy on a daily basis, and the majority of decisions depend on not only politicians but also on people themselves, NGOs and other organizations, and all the stakeholders of the process. Thank you. Giedrius Česnakas. I know Giedrius as a scientist and also as an expert of national defense. What are your insights? Could you share them? Thank you. Democracy is a community that has its own differences inside, but it seems to be united on the external front. Well, speaking about national defense is not mere fear-mongering. In terms of national defense, we are on a very good path of creating unity, community, and responsibility for the state. Because in recent years, state defense and protection was seen as the responsibility of the ministry and military forces. Now the situation shows that through cooperation and civic preparation, civic readiness, we can be able to create new links in society that form the basis for democracy. When we speak about universal readiness and preparation, we see the inclusion of armed forces, NGOs, paramilitary organizations, civic societies, kindergartens, hospitals, and wider public. We've seen greater cooperation here, and the ministries have finally agreed to meet and to discuss what can they do in any situation of a threat. Therefore, the best example from the system of national defense to strengthen democratic institutions, be them public or private, is the involvement and participation in the national defense, in universal defense. We visit schools and we see that school headmasters start considering that, creating their networks, cooperation models. And here we see a great breakthrough in towns and cities. We visited Finland and Israel. In Finland, we do not see fear-mongering, but we can really see the involvement of people and possible cooperation of people, their unity in their cooperation in discussing on the coordination efforts and actions. The same is sought in Lithuania. We see the added value in people-to-people cooperation and communication, which actually in turn strengthens the society and democracy. Winter research shows that 52% of citizens would be ready to contribute to the armed resistance. But the problem is that only 4% would be ready to organize such a resistance. So it means that we have more democracy, but we lack leadership here from the groups of society, from the wider public in different regions, cities, or towns. And here we have to work on this. And in terms of information security, we're very happy to see that 71% of respondents say that they're capable of deciphering information attacks. Certainly we can see some developments, positive developments, but still much has to be done in developing and spreading democracy beyond. Mr. Mayor, participatory budget was mentioned as an important factor and tool for municipalities. And here it means that the society can take certain decisions on the budget. Certainly we have to work on that, because we had some negative examples. So when we allowed voting on the Facebook group, and when we analyzed the results, we saw the voting from the non-existent accounts or accounts of fake accounts. And now we have provided the possibility of voting in writing as well. Another best practice that we have is that in schools we provide and allocate resources for school students and this is just the beginning, and we really have positive feedback from school pupils here. Another aspect is a great law on local authorities is that committee meetings are being broadcast. This is a very positive development, and we've noticed that committee meetings are much more popular among the public followers compared to the meetings of the council. Certainly this shows that citizens can participate in the development of our plans, and we invite and encourage them to engage in that. It means that citizens can express their expectations in terms of future plans. Another important democratic aspect is cooperation with NGOs and public organizations. And on that, in municipalities, we're really working very hard and see some positive results here. And this really has some positive democratic impact. Another proposal that we have is the decentralization of certain aspects of governance. For example, a national land service. For example, sometimes these issues are dealt by the National Land Service, and sometimes by the municipality or municipal council. And in some cases, municipal councils are responsible for taking decisions on, for example, land lease and similar matters. So we have to be very unified on this aspect and allocate the such responsibility on one service only. I think that National Land Service is the service that is completely unnecessary. Well, this is my opinion. I believe that this is an unnecessary institution. Another recommendation that I have is the increase of transparency and responsibility, and I believe that personal responsibility should be taken on municipal levels as well. We also need investment in civic education, in education of young people, in fostering political awareness of young people. Well, I'm just naming the ideas that I had before coming here. We also should focus on NGOs, educational organizations and institutions, and the initiatives, so that we could deal with or address matters together. And one of the most important recommendations is improving skills and competencies of civil servants. We really see the lack of that. We've been looking for the chief architect for our municipality for 5 years. And we see that there's a clash of requirements as to the educational background of the chief architect in municipality. Thank you very much. You have given very illustrative examples, very down-to-earth situation. And now, Professor Suvainys.
To conclude, we need to talk about the strengthening of the middle class. We talked about it, but one of the main drivers of democracies is the middle class, not only in cities, but only in regions. So we need to be proactive in this type of policy. This is the main area of focus. We are talking about the Ministry of Regions. Well, this is still to be discussed, but the middle class is the one that ensures public participation, and speaking broadly about education, health, social services, it is important that those services are of good quality, because when people are not satisfied with the public services, they are dissatisfied with the government. So these are the main things for the public sectors to focus. And we've been talking about public participation and its principles, but we need to understand that if the geopolitical temperature continues to increase, we will reach a point where the increased public participation will be natural, and we might come back to the governance that is neo-Weberian. Participation, citizens, all of these things are important, but in the face of geopolitical challenges, the state will have to work more in this area. Thank you, panelists, for your interventions, and I would like to ask the participants to join our discussion. Professor Dalius Serafinas, please introduce yourself. Dalius Serafinas, Vilnius University, and member of the Council of Kėdainiai. Participatory budget in our region is 200,000 euros per year. And we're talking about 0.2%. And this measure cannot be effective, therefore. And as for the strategic skills or the willingness to use these skills, I have the Ukmergė strategic plan for 2021, which is still valid. But there's the same issue in Kėdainiai. Look at their strategic documents, and you'll see that the geopolitical context is not included in those documents. There are no mentions of war consequences created by the COVID pandemic. And in the B section, we will talk about the gaps in democratic political process, but I'm only reacting to what I've heard here in this hall. What is our communication? For example, the tax reform that's underway. And the municipalities are offered to set the floor of that tax. And this type of communication is not understandable. It decreases the trust in the state. So what is our society? Are we a civic society or the society of plebs? And people in the government just want to collect the votes of the plebs. And our national broadcaster has a very important role. We say that we need to trust in institutions, and the national broadcaster is accountable for the Seimas of the Republic of Lithuania. But we have and we need to think systemically and to take systemic steps and to take control, because we talk about our resilience in the face of information war. So here are my few remarks, and I will elaborate on that in my presentation in the section B. The chair of the committee, Kęstutis Bilius. I would like to ask several questions for the panelists. We talk about democratic governments and public participation. We know that our society is getting older, which means that our democracy is also getting older. We know that young people are either not interested in politics or they have other challenges related to harmful substances. And there were tragic events in Kelmen, and the turnout of young people signalizes the democracy that is getting older in Lithuania. Are there any examples of how to solve the situations? Because the older people in Lithuania will eventually pass away, and if the young people in Lithuania are not involved into the governments, what is our future?
Reiškinį vadinčiau ne tik.
Well, this is not only aging, but atomization and the egoism of the generation. Atom is a small particle. So in this case, that there's an understanding of a person that he or she is on its own, and this is a really evident process that we have. And it results in people feeling unsafe, insecure, but because these people think that they are more important than anybody else and structures seem to be unimportant. I went to Dresden with my daughter, and she met a Chinese girl and asked her, how do you like your friend? Is there any continuation of your communication? And she said that no, she just wanted to communicate with somebody, and she spoke to a Chinese girl, but there was no continuation of this relationship. But Another thing is that young people have rights, but they don't have obligations. And this is a really serious problem that we need to fight, and we need to form community skills in schools. So we have to ensure that, because otherwise young people will suffer in the future. We have to balance here. And atomized society means that people find themselves in a desert. They are blown by the wind. In an integrated society, in contrast, the society is made strong. Our family relations traditionally have been something that have been keeping our society together. So therefore, weddings and funerals were actually something very popular in Lithuania. And now the situation is changing, and therefore there is a polarization of society. Now, anyone willing to respond? Giedrius Česnakas, I will react as an advisor to the Minister of National Defense in terms of demography. This is a problem that nobody wants to address, because this is a lose-lose situation. And here we see a longer period here. Now we see the development of the national security strategy, where the ministries will be able to give their own proposals, as well as the Seimas. And there are possibilities to contribute to that. I believe that the national security strategy, according to our tradition, is targeted or focused on external threats, and therefore my recommendation is to think about having demographic strategies. And I believe that certain experts in ministries are starting to consider that. This would be a long-term strategy. But in this case, again, we need to come back to the values. We had very individualistic values being taught in the past, and now we see the consequence, where only 34% of the population in Germany say that they would be ready to protect their state and defend their state, while others would be willing to flee the country. So we see that there was a very big gap between the government, public authorities, and the citizens. And therefore, we need to reverse the situation and to change the situation. And here, compulsory conscription could help us to bridge this gap between the public and public authorities and state authorities. Thank you. Anyone willing to react? Yes. Well, speaking about young people, I would like to share my insight. I'm from Šalčininkai district municipality. I have contacts with young people. I recommend social and public leaders to be more available to the young people, not to compete, but to try to explain young people what the state is, why young people should participate in state governance, why responsibility should be taken for the state, and why it is necessary for that young person to remain in Lithuania and to build democracy. When I enter the space of young people, I do that very frequently, and the availability of you as a politician among young people makes you audible and understandable. But this availability is something which is attractive. Recently, I've been in the pilgrimage and I was approached by a young person who was trying to approach me, but one day he approached me and started communicating with me. We spoke a lot in 5 days during our pilgrimage, but the person was really attracted by the fact that a politician was available and accessible. Sadly, the communication was not of a very high level that we have among us today, but the person was so happy because he had a direct contact with me as a politician. Therefore, I invite and encourage all the leaders around this table to be available and accessible to young people. Please go to schools, speak to young people. Take 1 hour to speak to young people. You will really be very famous, and young people will be really very willing to speak to you. They will really feel happy and be willing to participate in elections. We as adults foster their interest in the state governance. Thank you.
Dėkuoju. Dariau, prašau.
Aš tik tai papildysiu viceministrą.
Thank you. I would like to add to what the Vice Minister said. The accessibility of politicians, it's a high-profile task because finding email addresses, mobile phone numbers of politicians is a mission impossible. I looked at the websites of municipalities, and only a few municipalities have their phone numbers on their websites. I'm not even talking about the ministries. There was a day on which several fires took place, and we could not do anything. And if I didn't knew certain politicians in person, I would not have been able to solve that problem. I called Lukas Savickas and he helped me to solve this problem. So this accessibility is very important, and I would like to agree with the Vice Minister on that. Some people would probably want just to have a simple conversation. Thank you. Thank you. Let us finish on this note. Yaroslavas, the floor is yours. Thank you. I will have a remark for Giedrius. Despite all of these interesting discussions, maybe it's unpopular because the topic is controversial. I see that there is a lack of discussion of defense buying, because we talk about buying. It is natural. As a specialist, I understand that we need to act quickly and effectively, but there is an issue of democracy in this process, and there's a lack of democracy in this process. First of all, in Lithuania, in my opinion at least, there are not many experts on defense purchasing. And because of that, there might be serious questions in the future. And this is an issue to democracy because we're not aware of the process. And we need to carry out public procurements, but there are so many questions, and more discussions should be held. And Vainius mentioned corruption, but despite all of that, as a researcher, I addressed one of the institutions in Lithuania, the Special Investigation Service of the Republic of Lithuania, and I introduced myself as a professor, but they refused to talk to me. They were not even interested in my questions. The state control did not reply to that either. So this is the level of our discussion. I'm just raising questions about the lack of this discussion. So there's a new topic for our future meeting. Thank you, colleagues, once again for your active participation. Just a few words from Vidmante. The conference has just begun, but the discussions will continue after lunch from 1:30, and the conference will be divided into 3 sections. Panel A, democratic governance in the context of geopolitical challenges, the case of Lithuania. It will take place at the room 218, building 3 of the Seimas. Those who don't know how to find it will show you. Section B is on the strengthening of democratic governance, solutions and opportunities, which will take place in this hall. And the C section is titled Democracy, Security and Resilience. And some additional informations. Those who can't attend all of the 3 sections simultaneously, which is obvious, of course, the videos of those sections will be available at the Seimas website. Also, the General Jonas Žemaitis Military Academy of Lithuania and Mykolas Romeris University have prepared a booklet of summaries, which can be found on the website of Mykolas Romeris University, so you can learn about certain insights and read the summaries. We'll see you after lunch.